Bigfoot history would not be preserved. I really genuinely believe most of these stories would have been lost without the work of guys like Don Keating and John Green. And so, what we do is obviously entertainment, but there is a historical value to it that I'm quite proud of. But from Minerva, we moved into Priest of Whitehall, Boggy Creek Monster, and then we started moving out of Bigfoot into other topics like Mothman, Flatwoods Monsters, things like that. Throughout that whole time, my focus was always on the preservation of these stories, and very little, honestly, none of the early films that we made involved me beyond being behind the camera and kind of capturing the eyewitness accounts and things like that. What happened is there's an accidental shift over time that took me from these documentaries focused on unknown creatures and moved me into a position where I was more active and actually experiencing things for myself. And that started in 2018 when we made a film called On the Trail of Bigfoot, The Legend and the Search. Originally, they were released as just On the Trail of Bigfoot. It was a 6-episode miniseries. And I think it was episode 5, we went to a place called Area X in the Ouachita Mountains of Oklahoma. Have any of you seen the movie where we went to Area X? Okay, cool. So that's the first time I ever experienced anything. There were some odd happenings here and there, but for someone who had traveled around the country and visited places like Falk, Arkansas, and Whitehall, New York, where Bigfoot is said to exist, I had experienced almost nothing for myself. But in 2018, I went into Area X with my friend Adam Dugan, and over the course of we were not there long. It was about 2.5 days. We experienced, enough that it, I would say, it changed my life in a lot of ways. It's important to note, and I said this in the movie, but at that point in time where I was at, if there's a scale of quote-unquote belief in Bigfoot, I was at about 30%. I've been in enough places, I've done enough things, in active areas without ever experiencing something, but I was moving pretty far into the skeptical realm as far as like whether or not Bigfoot was real. I was really starting to think there's nothing to any of this. So, for those that don't know, Area X is a very remote site in the Ouachita Mountains, which is essentially an inland rainforest. It's kind of the perfect habitat for an unknown creature like Bigfoot. It involves an intense 2-hour drive down a 3 or 4 mile drive to get down into Area X. It's in this valley. Really unpleasant. I've spoken with I had a guy who used to be a paratrooper in the British military told me that the only thing he had to compare to getting into Area X was trying to get into certain areas of the Congo. So to get down into X was not an easy road, but that was my first introduction to it. It was this crazy 2-hour drive on this rutted out creek bed into X. And I will admit, I was very aware of Area X and everything that had happened there. Area X had been investigated by the North American Wood Ape Conservancy for about 20 years at that time. They had numerous encounters. There was a lot of stuff that was documented. You can find a lot of the research they've done on woodape.org. But we were in there for less than 3 hours before one of the guys that was in the group had a clear sighting of a Bigfoot. I just talked about this recently. I don't mention this very often because it's really weird. But on the drive-in, one thing that I was asking Alton Higgins, who was the guy that drove our drug stick down into X, I asked him if anyone ever had a sighting of a white Bigfoot in X. That was driven in large part because of the fact that I'm from Ohio, and when you're from Ohio, you're just going to naturally be aware of Don Keating and his work. If you're aware of Don Keating and his work, then you're aware of the white Bigfoot reports that Don Keating has captured over the years. And so I'm always interested in the white Bigfoot idea. So I asked Alton if there was a white Bigfoot, if they'd ever had a white Bigfoot sighting in X, and he had told me no. He said it's very doubtful we'd see that in here. The Bigfoot that Daryl saw was a white Bigfoot. That was within 3 hours of me asking Alton if anyone had ever seen a white Bigfoot. I don't know if I've ever publicly mentioned that, but that's a really bizarre aspect of our first day in X. Daryl sees this Bigfoot. He had eyes on it for multiple minutes, about 5-10 minutes, somewhere in that. We were able to trace his, we went back in with him and actually went through the sighting with him. That night, very little happened. We had some odd sounds. One thing that happened on this night that was interesting was the Brian Brown, who was a member of the group, had told me that there was a mountain lion that lived on the hill just behind the cabin where we were staying. And so that was my first night in X, was being warned that there's a mountain lion that very well might come into the campsite. So, just watch your back. The only other funny thing that happened that night was something approached the tent in the middle of the night. It walked up on the tent. Very likely this was a bear. We discovered that Adam, who was in there with me, had thought it would be a great idea to bring in candy bars, snacks, and have them in our tent. So when we radioed the cabin that there was something approaching our tent, the first question that we were asked was, "Do you have food in there?" And I said, "Well, no." And then Adam's like, "Actually, I have a bag full of goodies." And I just remember Daryl screaming, "You idiot!" And then telling me he had to take the bag out to the truck and get it out of our tent. So the rest of the night was quiet. Next day was interesting. We got lost in X, so that was fun. We were lost for a couple hours. There was a period of time where we were walking through the woods, and multiple times we encountered this smell. It smelled like maybe a bear or a horse, a really sweaty horse. Very strong smell, but it would come and go. Like we'd walk through it and then it's gone. But at this point we're down to very little time left. We've already been in there about a day and a half. We haven't had a visual. We haven't really had any vocalization. We heard some nonsense yet. And so the day goes pretty much without anything exceptional happening. And then that evening we were sitting in the dark, no fire or anything, and there's very little light because you're down in this valley. There's the leaf canopy kind of covers up all the overhead light. And we began to hear movement on the hill behind our campsite where we were sitting. And at some point, I decided I was going to stand up and turn on my camera and point it toward the hill. Now, for anyone that's already seen the movie, this part isn't going to be super exciting. But I did manage to film what I think is a Bigfoot face. So you're going to see in a second. But I'm not someone who, if you send me a red circle Bigfoot photo, I more than likely am not going to believe that anything's in the photo. So if you have the same skepticism regarding the stuff that I do, I totally understand it. But this is an interesting thing because I'm filming leaves, which is mostly what you're going to see with the there's sort of a white light that's outlined there. There's two eyes, what I believe to be eyes, and if you watch them, they seem to blink. So I'm going to play this for you. Also, there's probably, I don't know if the audio is going to work, but there might be music under this. I just grabbed the clip from the actual movie. So, all right, so this is what I believe to be a Bigfoot face. Okay, there's no sound. There you go. Now watch right about here, it blinks. There you go. We have one more glimpse of it there. So there it is. the potential for a Bigfoot case. So that happens that evening, and then it's worth mentioning that whenever I go on a shoot, I have some of the crew here, and they can vouch for this. Usually, if we're on a shoot, I will at some point have a migraine. I had a migraine for the entire 2.5 days we were in Area X. So that night, by about midnight, I had reached my wall as far as time I can. So we go to bed. I fall asleep, and around 2 a.m., I hear a very loud thud, metallic thud, and it echoed across the valley like a gunshot. I had just started to fall asleep. This thing burst me out of, immediately I'm wide awake. And then as soon as this thud happens, it's followed by a very loud whoop, and then what I can only describe as like gibbon-like laughter. And so this laughter was the creepiest part of it. For some reason, the whoop was like whatever, but the laughter was really unnerving. And it was happening in the middle of the night when there were no other sounds. So here's the thing, I was asleep, right? And I didn't have a recorder going because I am not a Bigfooter, I'm a filmmaker, and I don't know what I'm doing in the woods other than filming. So if it involves the camera, I'm fine, but I didn't have audio going, I didn't have anything. Thankfully, the North American Wood Ape Conservancy has recorders all over that area. So the incident happens, I make the movie comes out, years pass, the movie was released in, I think, 2018, not 2019. And years pass, and Matt Pruitt, who was in the North American Wood Ape Conservancy at the time, hits me up through the NAWAC forums and goes, hey, can you tell me the date that you were in X back in 2018? This is probably back in 2022, something like that. And I give him the date, and I say, and it was like right around 2 a.m. And within 5 minutes, I had the audio, and it verified what had happened. There's the clear sound of what we believe was a rock impacting the metal outbuilding that they call the hooch, followed by a very loud whoop. And then there's no laughter. So that's the part that I'm kind of like, where's the laughter? Because that was the most interesting part. But it kind of makes sense because this was a more distant audio recorder. The one that was actually closest malfunctioned that night. But we do have the rock impacting the hooch and a whoop. So, and I just found this. I'm going to try to play this, guys, but the audio is coming out of the speaker. So I'm going to turn it up as loud as I can. I'm going to put the mic to it. So prepare yourselves. I don't know what's going to happen here.
I heard it.
All right, it's distant. Did you guys actually hear that?
Yeah.
Okay. So, like I said, it was distant enough that I wish you could hear the impact sound that we heard. Because when the rock hit the hooch, it echoed so loud that I thought someone was firing a gun in the valley right by our tent. And so what happened is when there's a moment before the whoop, right? There's a moment, maybe like 2 seconds of silence. In that 2 seconds, I sat up and I looked at Adam and I said, it's starting. Then the whoop happens, then the laughter, and then I looked at Adam and I said, I think we're going to die. And there's so much audio from the North American Wood Ape Conservancy that's super interesting. They recorded what they call the Rain of Rocks, where over the course of an evening, dozens of rocks were launched onto the roof of this cabin in like a constant rush. I was expecting that. And instead, which seems to hold up as like sort of my pattern, it was a very brief encounter. But it moved the needle enough for me that I went from 30% these things are real to about, I don't know what I said at the time, maybe 70. Mark, was it like 70, 80?
Yeah.
70, 80. 70, 80 that they're real. And so some time passed until in 2021. And this is where my story, I think does change a little bit from being simply a documentarian of the weird to someone who is actively participating in the weird. So in 2021, Heather Mosier, who, how many of you know Heather? Okay, people know Heather. She's at her table right now. She's in there. So Heather and her husband moved to Minerva in the summer of 2021. And they had a property that was within a mile and a half of Heather's husband's her mother-in-law's house, where her mother-in-law had actually had a sighting back in 2017 in December. They own is it soybean fields? It's like soybean fields. Yeah. They had soybean fields, and she saw a Bigfoot walk across this field in the middle of winter. So that's within like a mile and a half of the house that they were at. So they were aware that there was activity in the general area, not specifically on this property. And within like, I would say a few weeks of moving in, they started experiencing things on the property that sort of defied explanation. Heather would leave out, some of you might call it gifting. She would put things in the woods, and some of these things would be taken, and occasionally they'd be replaced with something else, like a squirrel vertebrae, a skull, just your normal stuff that happens in rural Ohio. And so I was like, hey, let's do a Bigfoot Beyond the Trail with Alex and Eli out there. Let's get Alex and Eli. They were on their way back from Colorado. They'd just been on the road for 2 weeks. They stunk. They showed up. They haven't showered in 2 weeks, literally. So Alex and Eli show up on the property, and nothing happened. They heard some bipedal running through the woods one night, but that was about it. The only thing I experienced was my son and I were out there. Tommy was 4 at the time. And him and I were sleeping in a hunting cabin on the property. And, he's 4 years old, so he's asleep at like, I don't know, the normal child time was like 1 a.m. And so he's sound asleep, and I'm sound asleep. And then right outside the window of this cabin, one of the loudest knocks I've ever heard went off directly outside the window of the cabin. There's a tree that used to be there, so I'm over there, but there's a tree that was outside the window of the cabin. And to me, it sounded like something walked up and just power knocked this tree as hard as you possibly could. And so I wake up thinking Alex and Eli or Heather, someone was doing a knock to try and elicit a response. And so I'm ticked off immediately. I'm very unhappy that that's happening. And I go outside, and all you hear are crickets, and there's no one anywhere around. So I radio Heather and Alex and Eli, and they're nowhere to be found. In fact, Alex was in a tree stand surrounded by coyote at the time.
Ooh.
So he wasn't coming anywhere near the cabin. And Eli and the rest of them were on top of the hill, pretty far away. And so that's the only thing that happened. But I was like, there's enough stuff going on here that I think we should do a show. And we'll call it the Bigfoot Project. And what it'll be is we'll bring in sort of a local researcher or witness, and we'll have them stay with us out here, and we'll interview them. And then we'll go walk around the woods at night and do Bigfoot stuff. And so that was the original plan for the Bigfoot Project, and then things went very differently. And I'm going to talk about this kind of out of order chronologically, but the first night there, we had a ton of stuff happen. I'll hit that in a minute. But we knew after the very first night that these things were there. So the next day, the big plan was to do whatever we could to avoid ever seeing Bigfoot by driving around the property in a gator and hanging up trail cameras. So there's no better way to see a Bigfoot. So we're driving around the property, hanging up trail cameras, and it's middle of the afternoon, perfectly sunny summer day, and we're crossing. By the way, this property is about 400 acres, so it's a good sized property. So we're crossing this pipeline in the middle of the day, and so here's the thing. I have the footage of me seeing the Bigfoot. I don't have footage of a Bigfoot. So you'll see me react to seeing the Bigfoot, but you're not going to see the Bigfoot. So what happens is we're driving around trying to hang up these trail cameras, and I'm interviewing Corey, her husband, while he's driving the ATV, and I'm talking to him about the property and things like that. And I look up to my right as we're crossing the pipeline, and darting into the woods, so I see this thing for less than a second, is this upright, dark brown. I think in the video, well, in the video there's probably no audio actually, but in the video I might say black because initially I was freaking out so much, which I'm shaking like crazy when I was shooting this, but I for some reason said it was like a black individual, but it was a dark brown, heavily fur covered individual. That's what I would say, on its hind legs, and you could see muscle ripple through the arm as it ran. It was pumping its arm as it ran. I saw a profile. So, again, this is just me reacting to that, so you can talk to me about it afterward.
Hmm?
You guys hear that?
Did you get it on camera?
I don't remember.
You don't remember. What did you see?
I saw a huge black object run across that pipeline at full burst right as we came through there. I don't know how to fast forward this. That's a true moment, by the way, guys. That is what this is actually like when you're in the field for this stuff. The real takeaway from that is I was a lot skinnier then. That's my sighting. I mean, when I talked to Esteban about it yesterday, and I said I'm not 100%, I'm 99%. Because what I put eyes on was so brief. You know, but what else is running on two legs in farm country in Minerva in a fursuit? You know, so that's my sighting. But it was preceded the night before by an event that I actually put a lot more stock in, and that was when Heather and I had started conducting what we had planned to be sort of just an impromptu interview. We had a fire going. We had our kids were with us. Tommy was there. Her kids were with us, and they were all in the cabin watching their iPad. And we were out by the fire, and we believed we were surrounded by multiple Bigfoots that night. And the reason we believe that is there were very clear footfalls. There were. I'm pretty sure I did not include the clip from this, but mostly because I couldn't get the original. I wanted to show it to you guys without the music underneath it. Not actually, this section had no music, but I wanted to be able to really show you guys the initial footage. And unfortunately, currently I'm having a hard time locating it. But we were surrounded by what we believe were at least 4 to 5 individuals. The evening started off with something that we experienced repeatedly on that property, which was something hitting a rubber drum up at the top of a, not rubber, it's sort of it's one of those big, like, oil drums that are like a blue plastic or rubber, you know, like, they make a very loud noise if you hit them, believe me, because we heard this on numerous occasions. And it would always sort of signal the beginning of a lot of activity. If we heard this drum get hit, it meant there was a lot of stuff that was about to happen. And so the first time we heard it was this night. And sure enough, right after we heard it, I decided I was going to walk away from the fire. I was going to walk alone down the trail that leads to the hind cabin where we were and see what happened. And within minutes of getting into, seconds, honestly, getting into the woods, I started hearing footfalls. And they just approached like they did not care if I knew they were there. And they came first from my left, and then I started hearing movement on my right. And then there started being more movement from ahead of us, and so I eventually called Heather, and Heather and I stood on this pathway for in the neighborhood of like 20, 25 minutes, as these things moved in around us. And during that time, they threw rocks. We had a rock land right next to us. But the creepiest thing that happened is that I said the kids are in the cabin, right? So the kids were sitting next to a window in a section of the cabin. And they're all on a bed watching their iPad together. And while Heather and I are on the trail, Heather's husband has gone up on the porch of the cabin because he doesn't want to get too far from the kids. So he's up on the porch, and while he's sitting on the porch, he heard very clear bipedal footsteps approach the window where the kids are sitting. And so Heather and I are out on the path having this amazing, magical experience, and meanwhile there's something approaching the window that has our kids in it. Corey freaks out, starts screaming to try to scare this thing off, right? And jumps down off the porch, runs around, there's nothing there. The entire event was like the Area X stuff I'd experienced, but on a whole new level. And so after that weekend, sort of my outlook on not just Bigfoot, but kind of my outlook on witnesses changed dramatically, because I realized now I was a witness, now I'm a witness, and suddenly all the things that I've talked about over the years of, showing respect to witnesses and not mocking stories and things like that, it takes on a whole new life, because now I'm one of those people, right, that people are going to call crazy. I really haven't experienced how not devastating, but weird that can be, due to the fact that in the past year, my son, who's 8 years old now, he goes to school, had told some of his friends at school that I saw him. And they said, well, your dad's lying. And so that's a whole new thing that I had never expected to really experience. And I went from being simply like the guy that's documenting other people's encounters to a guy who's now having my own. Intelligence and awareness in the woods is I put that on here. I don't know why I did that. I'm sure I had a really good thought about it at the time. I would say that like the things in Minerva that came in on us that night did it very intentionally. There was no concern over us being aware that they were there. And typically the thing that I'm asked the most about this is, well, how do you know it wasn't just people? So what I would say is Heather's property is 400 acres in farm country on a road that is, a lot of the properties surrounding their property are family. And also, everyone out there is armed at all times, so you don't really go sneaking onto other people's farm property in the middle of the night in a fursuit, planning to terrify people because you might end up dead. So that's my only point of refuge. So the only other thing about it that really became important to me, like I said, the idea of myself becoming a witness, but there was also the thought of preserving that story and what's going on that property takes on a new life when you consider the fact that what happens to that story or these stories of Bigfoot encounters on this property when I'm gone. So it's nice that while we were doing all this, we were actually filming, which in a way was doing our own version of historical preservation. All right, that was Minerva. This brings us to the next point, which is mostly about the need for preservation in Bigfootery in general. And I grew up in a family that values history. My mom owned a historical bookstore when I was growing up. My parents both wore T-shirts that said, "Have a nice day, shoot a developer." They were big on the idea of preserving our history. And when we began making Minerva, the core reason behind making that movie wasn't that we wanted to make a bunch of money, because in 2015 there was no way to distribute a film as independent as we were. We made that movie for about $500, and the idea behind it was, let's put it on DVD or Blu-ray and get it out in public, and that's what we're going to do. So this wasn't a money-making scheme in 2015. Not that it is today either. But so we valued the idea of interviewing these witnesses, capturing their story from their perspective, putting it on film, and then preserving it for future generations. And to this day, I believe that is our greatest value as a production company. I wrote here, Bigfoot history is fragile. Stories die when people stop telling them. And that is a danger, a great danger when it comes to these stories and their history. When we were making Minerva Monster, we experienced this firsthand. One of Hallie's sisters passed away during the making of the movie. There was her account of what happened. I had only ever taken through phone, and I didn't record it. And so her version of what happened did not necessarily align exactly with what everyone else was telling me. And now her story is gone, correct? So the idea of preserving this stuff really took hold in the earliest days of the of Small Town Monsters. But one of the things I appreciate about Bigfoot people in general is we all feel, I think a lot of us feel an obligation to look for the truth, right? You're looking for the truth, you're curious about something. I hear the phrase seeking the truth on a daily basis from Bigfooters. And I think that is a very valuable approach to this stuff. There are no, or very few, mainstream institutions that care about Bigfoot. And so the capturing of these stories will not happen through mainstream science, mainstream history. We're kind of a laughingstock, whether we want to be or not. And so it is up to amateur researchers, filmmakers, authors to capture these stories. And I think that includes everyone in this audience today. One of the main reasons, too, by the way, that the mainstream ignores the subject isn't simply because there isn't a mountain of quote-unquote evidence for them to examine. It's in large part as well because of the way pop culture has portrayed Bigfoot, because of the way pop culture has portrayed Bigfooters over the last, 60, 70 years. And that is a stereotype we are seeking to break. So I wanted to talk real quickly about a few of the ways that we have approached preserving the history of the topic. In 2023, we made a movie called On the Trail of Bigfoot, The Origin, that looks at the work and career of John Green and the history of Sasquatch activity in British Columbia. It had really struck me that as the older generations start to pass away, we are losing sight of some of the people like Green or Grover Krantz or Renee DeHinden, who kind of like carried this whole thing on their backs for decades. And so for me, there was an importance in making On the Trail of Bigfoot, The Origin, that went beyond, just Bigfoot, and also focused as much on preserving John Green's work in the field. And, it's a very unusual film because my mom died 2 days before we were supposed to start filming in British Columbia. And when my mom passed, I had a flu. And so the plan originally was, let's just send the whole crew to BC without me, and they'll film this movie. So we sent the crew to BC, and I was waiting at home for Dad to give me a call to tell me when Mom's funeral would be. Because the plan was like, if I can get well enough, I'm going to fly to British Columbia. And so turned out there was a week between her passing and the funeral, so I was able to go to British Columbia and experience British Columbia with the crew. But what ended up happening is there were two separate movies being made. There was sort of my processing of my mom's passing, which makes up a small portion of the movie, and then this larger look at British Columbia history and how so much of the Bigfoot topic and what we consider to be some of the tentpoles of the Bigfoot history originate there, and a lot of that has to do with John Green. So that was importance of honoring the old guard is a big. Anyone who's watched our movies, there's typically there's something with Grover Krantz, there's Hinden, there's Robert W. Morgan. These are guys that, again, like I feel like we stand on their shoulders. Preserving regional voices, Don Keating. If you're from Ohio, you know who Don Keating is. Like, this is an irrefutable fact. I grew up in Bolivar. I was not really aware of the Bigfoot subject, but I knew who Don Keating was. As strange as that might seem. And for me, when we started doing projects focused on Ohio Bigfoot, this was a major part of doing that. I wanted to be able to talk to Don Keating, get his take on how he approached research and how much the topic had changed in his time of conducting his research. And by the way, Don Keating isn't the only Ohio Bigfoot researcher. There's guys like Ron Schaffner, who we barely remember those names today. If you say those, does anyone in the room know who Ron Schaffner is? Yeah. He's one of the OGs, and he approached this subject with a really cool skepticism. He did all this like grassroots. He would do weekly or monthly newsletters that he would write and print himself. And like I just asked how many people knew who that is, and I heard one person say they know who he is in this room. So that is what I think is a value in what not just we. This isn't like a two small town monsters horror thing. This is anyone who's involved in documenting this is doing a service to the community, whether they know it or not. Without documentation, these stories will vanish, and I genuinely believe. Capturing critical cases, Bill Brand at Whitehall. Bill Brand passed, I want to say, Mark, was that last year?
Last year.
That was last year, Bill Brand passed.
Yeah.
And when we were making Beast of Whitehall, we ran into the same exact problem we ran into with Minerva, which was that we lost a major witness while we were leading up to filming that movie. And how many of you in attendance are aware of Bill Brand? So there's a couple more. There's maybe like 4 of us. So Henry May has to know. That's what I'm talking about. Bill Brand did a lot of really valuable research in the 70s and 80s and 90s and into the early 2000s around the Adirondacks in New York. And his outlook on the subject would be lost without the documentation that not just our films have done, but even shows like Monster Quest or the book he wrote, Monsters of the Northwoods, which he did with Paul Bartholomew. So there's a great importance to that. Oral history turned into permanent record. Again, I don't know what I was thinking there. That's my mom. So, like I said, my mom is a key piece of why I am the way I am, for better or worse. She would argue for that. But I think it's important to understand something, and I wrote this down on another page here, but there's a you have to do this for the right reasons, or over time it will wear you down to where you're no longer willing to stay involved. And so involvement in the field requires a lot of passion for the topic. And in approaching it with that level of passion and enthusiasm, it could ultimately lead to the recognition of a species of Sasquatch. It's literally that simple. Because there's no pay in this for Bigfooters, correct?
Mm-hmm.
There's not a lot of money for small production companies, which is why I think we're one of the only ones that focus on cryptids and the unusual, and why we do what we do. And so I hear a lot, especially on YouTube, which is just a bastion of positive discourse. Very well educated, smart, intelligent people. We hear a lot that we're in this for the money, that we're entertainment only. It's just entertainment, blah, blah, blah. And I come to find in my time involved in the field that, again, we don't have mainstream interest in this subject. There is a great value in the authors, the filmmakers, and especially the podcasters, by the way, that I don't think is given the credit that those fields deserve. Podcasting is the reason I'm as involved in all of this as I am. It was from listening to Sean Forker's Sasquatch Experience episodes and old Eric Altman episodes of, oh my gosh, Beyond the Edge. Or Don Keating used to do a show called the Sasquatch Triangle. So those are podcasts that I listened to, and because of that, they got me interested in the subject. They also did things like preserve interviews with John Green and Renee DeHinden that otherwise we would not have the opportunity to hear those people speak today. So there's a great value in that. I wrote The Duty We Inherit, and that's because, my parents were heavily involved in history and preservation of history, and apparently I inherited that part from them. So, the real mission. All right. So this is, for us, ultimately more about the search for the creatures and the people that are searching than it is about the Bigfoots themselves. That is my personal interest area. I know people like Cliff Berrickman are very different from me. He's all about the Bigfoots. He's not super into hearing about the people that have done this. But I'm interested in people. And people like Don Keating and Bill Brand are the reason I'm doing this today. And so I think there's a great importance in telling this story that's now gone on for decades and preserving that for those that come next. Because there's a lot of younger people that are getting interested in this topic. And if we don't do what we can to preserve what has happened in the past, they're just going to repeat the same stuff. We see another dozen pod standing Muppet videos before the end of the year. If we don't document it, and by the way, when I say we, I mean everyone here. If we don't document it, no one will. And again, that's because no one's taking this very seriously. We have a responsibility to the future to continue telling these stories. And that's the crew, by the way, that filmed Boggy Creek Monster back in 2016. Prior to that shoot, the biggest crew I had was 3 people at any given time filming a movie. Beast of Whitehall was made by myself, the guy that did the music for our movies, who held a boom mic, which he had never done before, and it shows. And my dad, who would hold a reflector and then drive us around. So that was our second movie. But this was Boggy Creek Monster, where we had a full crew. So for me, whether or not Bigfoot has ever proven to exist, the story of the people who dedicated their lives to finding it must not be lost. And when you see guys like Don Keating or Esteban or Cliff, tell them thank you for the work they've done, because especially your Don Keatings have been largely overlooked. Television, maybe in the 90s would talk to Don Keating, but today the value that he can add to the story, the retelling of Bigfoot, it has been lost. And so tell someone like Don Keating you appreciate their work there. But Small Town Monsters has been here since 2015. I don't think we're going anywhere. If you're interested in watching what we do, we have a YouTube channel that updates twice a week, usually. And then we put out feature films throughout the year. We have been struggling with distribution for the last 2 years. The last distributor we had decided to file for bankruptcy and not pay any of their filmmakers for 2 years worth of work. And so we've been struggling for the last 2 years to find new distribution means, and that's one of the reasons we're so heavily focused on YouTube right now. But coming up this year, we have a movie about the Ape Canyon event called The Siege of Ape Canyon. That'll be one of our next films. Our next film coming out is called Lost Contact. It's about the Thomas Mantell UFO event that happened in Kentucky. And we have 2 other Bigfoot movies coming out this year as well. We have one called From the Beyond that is sort of like a spiritual sequel to our Invasion on Chestnut Ridge movie. That's set in the Bennington Triangle. And then we have another movie called The Kinderhook Creature coming out as well. So I'll be out at my table. So if you want to come out and say hi or talk to Heather's over there. You know what? Courtney wanted me to say this while I'm up here, so I'm going to say it. If you've had an encounter in Salt Fork State Park specifically, please make sure you talk to Heather at our table because they're interested in potentially filming if you're interested. Or in general, if you've had an encounter anywhere, Heather's good to talk to you about that. So that's it. I hope I didn't bore all of you immensely. I do my best. I haven't done any public speaking engagement in 6 years. So.
Wow.